Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kim Walker. I'm the Director of Publications at ASME, and it's my pleasure and honour and privilege to be hosting this ASME Bite-Size session. This is number 16 in our programme, How Time Flies. It doesn't seem that long ago since it was just a thought in the ASME board members' brains, but it's good to see that it's working well and we have had a very varied programme. This session will last approximately 15 minutes and I'll just start off with a few housekeeping rules. So if you wish to ask a question, please use the chat field. This feature is available by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. It may be that we don't get time to answer all the questions, in which case we will provide a document after the webinar with any questions that we are unable to address. The chat field is obviously available for you to contribute to conversation. We may invite some participants to expand on their comments by asking their permission to make their audio and video live. And please respond via the chat feed that you are happy for us to add you as a temporary panelist to join the discussion and expand on your comments. This webinar is being recorded. This is obviously so that we can save it and put it up on our ASME website for people to view at a later date. And again, if there are any questions, all the questions and answers will also be available, plus any other support materials. If you're having technical problems, could we ask that you make ASME aware by emailing events, that's events, at asme.org.uk, rather than adding it to the comments field. We do have somebody standing by dealing with that email address, and they'll be able to help you with that. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Anique Atherley, who is a PhD candidate based at the Western Sydney University and Maastricht University. And the reason that she is presenting today is that Anique was the recipient of the Medical Education Journal Travelling Fellowship. Her research focus is how medical trainees' relations and social support networks are affected by the transition between preclinical and clinical training, which are integral parts of their education. Excuse me, so over to you, Anique.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. Let me just share my screen. I want to thank Kim for introducing me. Thank you so much. I will first do a short poll just to see who's in the room. So you should see it pop up on your screens, just to get an idea of what the background of the attendees are. Okay, thank you so much. So it looks like we have primarily lecturers, medical education researchers, clinical tutor, and physician, and I see one other. So thank you for filling that out. I'm going to get started now. So today I'm going to share with you one of my PhD projects, and the title is Diverse, Dynamic, and Deliberate Networks of Students Transitioning to Clinical Training. And this is, as I said, one of my PhD projects that I did. So transitions are everywhere in life. You see them in nature and in our life experiences. So the next poll that you'll see would be for me to ask you about your experiences of transition in your life. So you see first question there, how would you describe your last big life transition? And it could have been anything. And I see that we've had a mix of work transitions, training transitions, life transitions, geographical transitions, and they are quite inevitable periods in our lives. So thank you for that. So, you know, even as law students may go from being a law student to being a partner and a bit closer to home. Medical students ultimately can become an attending, and between any major transitions, there are always these little phases in between as well. But we're going to focus on the medical education continuum, or continuum, as you would say, whereby medical trainees undergo frequent transitions in training, and these are often imposed either by their healthcare systems, such as medical doctors switching between teams, for example, or imposed by their programs. So preclinical students going from being in the classroom primarily to seeing patients every day. And these transitions are said to be periods of transfer of previous training to their new environment. So for example, medical students going from preclinical training are transferring their classroom And actually, the discourse of transitions in literature has been kind of negative over the years. These shifts in training have been said to lead to distress and anxiety, self-doubt, limited speaking up behaviors, and eventually medical errors, which is what we want to avoid. However, recent literature and recent authors are acknowledging the opportunities that are inherent in transition periods. Minster in the UK considers them to be critically intensive learning periods, which I think is the perfect kind of term for a transition period, and really recognizes that they do present probably more of an opportunity for development than a threat to development. In my first PhD project, I actually did a scoping review, and we looked at how medical educators and researchers approach transitions in medical education. And we focused on the transition from preclinical to clinical training. And we found that researchers and educators consider the transition from three main perspectives. And of course, these may overlap. So from an educational perspective, there's a thought that a transition period from, for example, from preclinical to clinical training is a gap of knowledge and skills. And therefore, we address that gap in knowledge and skills between phases by giving transition courses, trying to prepare our trainees as much as possible beforehand. But if you consider the transition from a social perspective, you acknowledge that the newcomer is entering a new social context, and that existing social context has their own relations between each other. And a newcomer now tries to become integrated into those relationships. And therefore, an intervention here may be early introduction of clinical staff to newcomers, for example. And that's less seen in the literature so far. And even less seen is transitions from a developmental perspective, where there's the acknowledgement that there's almost a sense of empowerment, where the focus is on trainees' development and their growth, and interventions here really focus on lifelong learning skills and things that they can use in the future. So interventions here would do things like coaching and portfolio assessment and those kinds of things. But this project that I am going to talk to you about is from a social perspective. And that's because we thought that relationships do provide access to learning opportunities. That's seen in the literature as well. And it's also known that social integration is often quite difficult for newcomers. And what's called the buffer hypothesis says that social support, so relationships with others, helps to buffer that stress. So helps to buffer out that negative aspect of transitions that we've seen before in the literature. And social support is defined as any social transaction that is helpful for the receiver in a particular situation. So this leads towards our research questions. We want to study social relationships in order to help us understand what and then how these relationships mitigate stress, increase motivation, and promote learning. And we thought that social network analysis could help us in this understanding. So what is social network analysis? This is the study of relationships and connections, usually between individuals, but these entities do not necessarily need to be human. So you can have a whole network or an ego network. So I'll just briefly introduce you to some concepts so that it will make my presentation a bit easier to digest. If you talk about a whole network, these dots that you see here represent people. If you are talking about, say, my network, the different people in my network will be considered to be alters. And our relationship is called a tie in social network analysis language. And one other thing I should say is ego, that refers to self. So a whole network will be if you map the connections between an entire class. An ego network will be if you map the connections for specific people. So why SNA and educational research? We do have a few studies in medical education so far using social network analysis. And the reality is that many educational studies actually draw on network-related theories and ideas, for example, social capital theory. And social network analysis also complements other theoretical approaches like collaborative learning and social cultural learning, where there's the recognition of the impact of others on the learning experience. And using SNA would also give researchers a chance to describe what those kind of structures are and their functions and outcomes. So therefore, we sought to answer two research questions: who are in the social networks of undergraduate students transitioning to the clinical environment, and to what extent do undergraduate students' networks change as they transition to the clinical environment? And what are the mechanisms behind these changes? So to do this, we actually did a qualitative social network analysis project Usually social network analysis is usually done through surveys historically, but we use interviewing. And I did this in Australia, where I am enrolled, on 8 newly clinical students. So they were in their 3rd year in that curriculum. There's a 5-year curriculum, and in 3rd year, they enter clinical training. And we interviewed them twice, at T0 within the first week of their clerkship, and then 5 months later. And we used sensitizing concepts from landscapes of practice, which was useful because it allowed us to kind of understand the realities of being in a rotation-based clerkship experience, for example, because as students enter clinical training, they basically enter a landscape, and across this landscape are numerous communities of practice in medicine and surgery and pediatrics. And there are different useful concepts that we took from that theory that help us to understand what the processes occur there. First, I asked students to list anyone that they thought had an impact on the transition experience thus far, and that could have been anyone. They did this using a name tag, which essentially was a post-it note, and they were able then to identify them, let me know their role, their gender, whether their influence was positive or negative. And then we also had their rank, as we knew what number they recalled the person as. We then asked them to basically arrange them on 4 concentric circles, which designated the impact that they had, or the relative impact that their alters or their people relationships had. So if they put them closest to their names, that means that they think they had the most impact. If they put them further away, they had the least impact. And then we had a conversation about that, and I recorded the interview processes. So this is just a video of one of my participants going through her process, and you can see that she points at different alters that she discusses and describes how they influence that point. So then it ended up with data at T0, right when they enter clerkships, and T1, 5 months later. And these would have encompassed 16 social network maps and interview transcripts. So we ended up with one big database of relationships. So I was able then to have a big list of all the alters that were in all 8 networks at both T0 and T1. So for example, this is one person's database, for example. At T0, these are the people in their network, and at T1. And these names are all pseudonyms, so there's no worry there ethically. And you know, the database then had in their roles, gender, positive, negative influence, and the weight of their influence. And that weight designates which circle they were placed on. Getting a 4 if they were placed closest to the person, and getting a 1 if they were placed further away. So I'm going to divide my results into 3 sections: network structures, networks on the move, and mechanisms for network change. The network structures. What do the networks of students look like as they transition to this new environment? So we found that at T0, there were 128 ties, alters, relationships, whichever term you prefer. And at T1, this only marginally increased to 134, which is not what we expected. But I'll get to that. So first, at T0, in terms of proportions, the network was made of primarily of doctors, near peers, meaning anyone in medical school that was not in their cohort, and peers. And the influence varied. So academics, nurses, support staff, and peers were actually on the outermost circles, whereas people like family staff were actually on the inner circles. And the third thing we saw is that there were actually a few alters that were in more than one network. And quite often these are institutional positions. Some of them, they probably didn't know how much support they were providing to their students. So that's something that we can discuss a bit later. So for example, this is David's network, and I've left the concentric circles as he would have completed them. This is a reenactment I did on PowerPoint from his map. And here you can see that Kendra, Terry, and Mom are the 3 closest or most impactful people to him at this point. This is at T0, right when he's entering clinical training. And you can see that the peers are on the outermost circles. In terms of, if you then look at the global networks, so this is David again and his networks, this is Greg and his network, this is Alistair and his network. And these are what I talk about, the people that are located in more than one network. And in landscape of practice theory, we can call these brokers. So these are people that allow for information to really pass through groups of people. And this person was a socially, institutional voted role. She was a student, head of the student body, basically. And she ended up really did having an impact on a lot of people. So for example, David there says, Kendra's all over the place. Everyone knows her. I think I've messaged her a couple of times because she posted for the OSCE. And she would actively say, let's meet somewhere. She's genuine about it. That's what I love. So let's look at how things changed over time. So after 5 months, networks rose only to 134. There were 85 new ties, 99 dissolved ties, and 28 kept ties. That's kind of what the changes looked like. And the role composition was significantly different between time points. So if I just highlight here, the doctors did increase, near peers dropped, and these are the total across all 8 participants, the numbers that you see here. The peers increased and nurses also fell. So looking at Nicole's networks at T0 and T1, again, reorient you. These are the concentric circles. Inner means most impactful and outer means least impactful. And for example, straight away, we can see how many near peer ties Nicole had at T0, and she only had 4 5 months later. And comparatively, she had no peers at T0, and then she had a whole set at T1. And this was a trend that we saw as well. Family ties often were stable in that they were kept and they were maintained, but we did see that some participants, they did drift over time. So what are the mechanisms and the reasons for these changes? So we consider the overall mechanism to be called deliberate network management. And this is mainly the realization that participants chose to create, keep or dissolve ties or instrumental support. And regarding emotional support, this was largely surrounding trust and accessibility. So this was usually provided by family and roommates or patients. For example, in terms of trust, Nicole realized over time she could actually trust her peers. I think maybe I should have opened up a little bit earlier if I had troubles, the people in my cohort a bit more. I mean, I don't feel like I've had a lot of issues, but I would kind of feel embarrassed to bring up issues. I didn't want to seem weak in front of other people, but now I just tell people everything. It really helps me not to overthink things and keep things in perspective, so I should have done it earlier. Over time, she recognized the benefits of reaching out and interacting with her peers. And sometimes peers could actually make experiences can also go negatively. For example, David dissolved the tie with a near peer because she didn't provide the emotional support he thought she was going to produce. Terry, I was supposed to see her that day after our meeting, but she had other commitments. She really made me feel bad because I was desperate for some help and she left me hanging out to dry. That's why there's no senior student in this picture right now. No one helps. And again, that was a trend where our participants realized that near peers had their own work to do and they weren't able to provide a lot of the support that they thought that they would have. And as I mentioned, family ties were quite stable, and that's because they were accessible and trustworthy. For example, Kendi says, when I go through hardships or obstacles and stuff, my dad is always there to talk to me if I'm feeling upset. And then she described a specific example of an experience she had during that week. Instrumental support was largely surrounding expertise. So participants sought out ties that they thought had expertise in a particular area, and therefore were able to provide them with some kind of guidance, largely academic. And this is largely provided by near peers, especially at T0 and doctors. So Sunita here says they just always ask us questions and then they went through the guide, which I don't think a lot of doctors do. So they were trying to teach us at least one topic over coffee, even though they were really busy with their work as well. Doctor here was a big thing for her, Alana, to make sure that everyone was really comfortable and doing okay. You know, she had experiences maybe with people not being as nice to her when she was a student. So it was important for her, for me, not to feel that way. And if I look back at Nicole's maps, this was a tie that persisted over time, showing the importance of instrumental support or perceived instrumental support. So we did find that networks were diverse, dynamic, and deliberate. So they were diverse in that we expected largely people to be choose people that were within the clinical space. And this wasn't necessarily so. People chose their roommates. They also chose their family members. They were dynamic. We expected them to grow significantly, and they didn't actually. But they did change over time, especially the structures. So for example, the near peers decrease, peers increase, and nurses decrease, for example. And they were the result of deliberate management. So they were deliberate. So students over time really learned who to depend on, and they dropped ties that they didn't think they couldn't depend on anymore. So moving forward, network development could be a social outcome of medical training, actually, and it's not something that we think about often. We do talk about networking in a very casual sense, but this is actually a functional aspect that could be measured. So could SNA be a marker of social integration by measuring network size and content? We found dwindling relationships with nurses and no relationships with any other professionals. This could have implications for interprofessional collaborations. And SNA, or a process similar to this, could help to recognize brokers and support them. For example, that poor near peer who was in about, I think, 6 of my 8 networks, for example, she probably didn't expect by taking that position that she would have been basically the go-to for an entire student body, not only at events, but on the everyday occurrence. So it could be important to recognize these workers and support them. So in conclusion, this is, to our knowledge, the first SNA paper to explore social networks during a transition during the medical continuum. Networks we found to be diverse, dynamic during the transition to clinical training, or to CLERKSHIPS. And this deliberate network management was based on whether or instrumental support. And I just want to highlight my research team, who included Kim Trinison and Deanna Dolmans from the Netherlands, Wendy Hugh and Iman Agassi from Western Sydney in Australia. And we added Laura Nineman, who has a wealth of knowledge in social networks. And she's the reason that I got my ASME medical education traveling grant, so that I can go and spend some time with her to really kind of make sense of all the data that I've had. Thank you also to the reviewers for optimizing the paper, which is now in press. And these are my references, and I'll take any questions, and we can have a nice discussion about social networks or transitions that you may have. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anique. That was very interesting, and looking at a different perspective in terms of transitions. I'm not sure about others, but there were certainly some times with me when it just slightly broke up. So it may be that some people would wish to have some clarification about certain things. If you have got any questions, don't hesitate to put it in the chat, or if you want any clarifications of anything. So just while the people are thinking about what they might want to ask, a question for myself is that, well, there are a couple of things. The first, unless I picked it up wrong, did it appear that to begin with their near peers were really quite important, but when they moved to the CLERKSHIPS, the near peers seemed to almost disappear off the radar, if you like to call it, because that's what it reminded me of, a sort of radar screen with all the various points on it, and so and you did talk a bit about that, and I was just wondering whether, do you think that is purely due to social things, or perhaps the other interesting bit was about you didn't mention physical at all, because I've been doing some work with transitions, and physical is one of the areas that we're looking at. And do you think that impacted on the social stuff? And I would welcome your comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Definitely over time, the near peers did kind of drop off the radar. And again, I think part of that was that near peers have their own work to do. They're also medical students, and often the near peers that they depended on were actually above them. So there were people that were entering final examinations. And there was some disappointment from my participants over time that their near peers weren't helping them out anymore. And those ties eventually were lost, which is kind of sad. But again, that's the reality, that the near peers they didn't sign up to support a whole class, a whole cohort below them. So those are all things that I think, where the brokers are, oh, I see, Lizzie, sorry. There's a question in the
just
chat.
Missed that final bit. You just broke up for that last bit. So just to clarify that sorry, just to clarify, so what you were saying is you felt that the near peers were concentrating on their own stuff rather than signing up to support others?
Yes, I was just saying that essentially they didn't sign up to support an entire cohort below them. So the reality is that their peers began to focus on their own work, and that then, you know, led to some disappointment in my participants as well. Yeah.
I mean, that's quite an interesting concept when you think about particularly the situation we're in at the moment. And we do think about when people come, you know, postgraduate, that actually the people who provide their support are their peers or their near peers, and yet you're saying when they move from being, you know, the student type thing to the post, then actually clerkships, they seem to move away from that. So it might be interesting to look to see whether they go back to that once they finish the medical degree and start working. I just think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, so question from Lisi, were the brokers aware of their role?
Yeah, no, in short, the brokers were people that had an institutional position. I didn't really want to name what that position was, but one of them was a student, actually. She was basically like towards the head of the student body. And even though that was an administrative role, really, she ended up being looked up to by all of my participants, for lack of a better word. So whereas she knew that she was, you know, head of the student body, she wouldn't have expected to almost be leaned on for everyday support from a whole cohort of students, for example. So that's why I think that doing these maps could be illuminating, really, to help brokers become aware, that help institutions realize who brokers are, who people are looking to for information, and maybe there needs to be more than one of them, or those brokers themselves should be more supported.
Okay, great, and hopefully that answers Lisa's questions. So another question, just to maybe elaborate on that. So just to elaborate on that, so you've talked about they weren't aware. So she's saying, so did you replace the near peer due to being more visible? Does that make sense?
I don't really understand.
So did you replace the near peer due to being more visible? Do you understand the question?
No, not really.
I think I mean the broker.
Yeah, so the broker dissolved over time. So the person wouldn't have been in the second.
Okay, great. So another question, could you elaborate a bit on the emotional? Yeah. Could you elaborate a bit on the emotional support and instrumental support for network development? What sort of things were you thinking about in terms of support?
Yeah, good question. So emotional support surrounded largely managing everyday emotions. Maybe the student had a bad day, they didn't understand why attending reacted to them in a particular way. So these were mainly people that provided that kind of emotional support. And these largely surrounded their family members that they might have gone home to. And we actually found an important, interesting function of venting, where people that provided emotional support became an avenue for venting for our participants. And venting became a very important attribute, actually, having someone to be able to vent to. We actually found that quite interesting. And in terms of instrumental support, that largely surrounded academic guidance. So guidance on clinical skills, guidance on knowledge. So that's why this was largely provided by near peers initially, and then ultimately by doctors.
Okay. Hopefully that's answered the question. That was Esther who asked that. This is from Lorraine. Was the pulling back of near peer support detrimental to student development in terms of confidence and skills? Because obviously developmental was one of the bits in your slide.
Yeah, great question as well. So there was actually one participant in particular who really was shattered by his realization that the near peers weren't helping him anymore. And he actually had to end up taking some time off from school. And that's because he realized that he was putting all of his effort into maintaining these near peer relationships, and then the near peers started to disappoint him. So that really did shatter his confidence. He really began to question why he was there. No one was going to help him. So I do think, again, potentially that's something that we could look at and consider. And that's why sometimes these very formal interventions where we have their peers telling the people below them about what to expect, that might be beneficial in that there's a dedicated time to do this thing. But if we have 100 people going towards 10 near peers that are providing support, then that can become a bit much, I think, for the near peers, and then leave the ones below feeling unsupported.
But presumably people chose their near peers for support were people either they were friends with or colleagues with or work with or whatever. And I suppose, and then so naturally some people might have a large group and some people might not have any, many at all, if you know what I mean, because just very the nature of social interactions. So in terms of, an intervention, say having brokers or things like that, I mean, how do you make that, because social is very much about a person-to-person contact. So how do you make any intervention which involves that, not say permanent, but does it feel like you're impacting on it directly?
Mm-hmm. So I feel in terms of intervention, I think coaching is perhaps the best way to go. But of course, coaching is very time consuming and personnel consuming as well. So even though we do need to look towards more social interventions, I do acknowledge that they're perhaps going to be time consuming. There's research out there about mentors, and mentors sometimes feeling burdened because they have a lot to do in terms of their mentees as well.
Great, thanks. And maybe this is just a bit following on from it. This is from Kevin. He says he's curious about the implications of the findings you're describing for the teaching and the practice of teamwork. And do the experiences you describe of dissolving relations reflect a hidden curriculum regarding the extent to which people feel a need to be independent? Which is a very good question, Kevin.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that probably needs a long answer. But I think that kind of independence happens anyway over time. And I think that happens for many reasons. I don't necessarily think they feel a need to be independent, but I feel they realize they have to be independent over time. So I think that because of their dissolving relations, they kind of then look to themselves. There was someone that said, that's why there are no seniors here, because no one is helping. He had that perception, really. So I think it's a bit of both. And in terms of teamwork and collaboration, I do think that awareness is probably most important. So a lot of doctors may not be aware how much of a significant impact they have. They may think that they are only impactful during their clerkship, but actually there were doctors that persisted over time despite the student leaving that clerkship. So if you are a great doctor, it may be then that you end up having a whole bunch of students looking up to you for advice and support over time, which again could be a burden on you as well. So I just think it's a lot to do with awareness, really.
But just taking that step forward, I mean, does that impinge on the culture of both the organisation and of the organisation? Because just thinking about medical students in the UK, we spend a lot of time in terms of student support, in terms of pastoral care, having student support people, having there's various different roles, and as Lucy's pointed out, academics didn't seem to be mentioned much there. Is that because they weren't a specific? Did they pick up under something else? And I suppose universities spend a lot of time providing support for students. And I suppose if you take that into the work world, employers spend a lot of time providing support for staff. Is it because they're not accessing it, because they think it's being provided from the organisation, that's not what we're supposed to do? Did you look at that at all?
Yeah, so that kind of came out as well. So I think what happens there also is that the academics are not in the clinical world. Like, even though they may know about it, obviously a lot of them are doctors, for example, that are now in academia full time. I think students more look to people in their current environment. And I think that's probably what happens. And you're right, that institutions spend a lot of money in student support. being able to kind of tick that box, right? But in terms of accessing and students accessing it, especially in the clinical arena, I think it becomes difficult because students begin to separate themselves from the institution actually. Once they go to the workplace, they begin then to see themselves more as, you know, an upcoming doctor. They're no longer kind of separating themselves from the university to which they're attached as well. And I just saw a brief comment there from Lizzie, and I was about to talk about that, in that there's also a stigma attached to going and seeking the support or going to the school counselor. That's something that's looked down on, actually. And students get that in their environment, and they embody it over time as well. So they wouldn't want to go seeking support, as they may say that they may seem as they're weak. So.
Well, do you not think that's sad then, that if they've already got the stigma at student level about seeking support, then how on earth are we going to change it throughout their whole career transition if it's already embedded at university? Then you're always going to be playing catch up afterwards, which makes life even more difficult.
Yes, exactly.
When you're working at the other end.
Yeah, exactly. So even like the student that had to take time off, he said he took weeks to make that decision. He didn't want anyone to know he was taking time off. He wanted it to be very hush-hush. He pretended that someone in his family was sick. Also, he didn't have to, you know, be known as a person that took time off. So.
And I think that's something that, you know, definitely we need to think about, because you know, being a student or a medical student is all about preparing them for the workplace. And we talk about how things change when they go into the workplace and role modeling and all the rest of it. If it really saddens me that if they feel there's a stigma at that level, then we need to work even harder at all levels about reducing stigma, because about getting support is not about having a mental health condition. It's just about being able to talk and have that support and make you feel a bit more valued and getting through things. And if they're worried about it as a student, it really worries me further on down the line, when they might not be able to seek that support because it's embedded. So in terms of that, are you thinking about anything in terms of your interventions from an organizational or cultural perspective?
Mm-hmm. I do feel like the first step, it depends on what the intervention you're talking about. There are many interventions that perhaps are needed. But if you're talking about to optimize social relationships, then I do think that people in other communities, like in organizational literature, use network mapping as a tool, basically to create awareness on people's support systems. Because as I did a similar session before, and I had the attendees to map out their own networks, and kind of that awareness makes people realize on who they can depend in difficult times. And everyone has a difficult time sometimes. That's not unusual for people. So I do think that alone could be an intervention, actually. Maybe something that I'll do in the future, we'll see. But in terms of the institutional, I do think becoming aware of your brokers, I think it starts there, because those brokers also have a significant responsibility, and a lot of them don't know about it, I don't think. They probably never realize that by taking on a particular role that they're going to be providing support to so many students, actually, on a day-to-day basis.
And so do you think there's going to be a universal job description for a broker?
That's interesting. I never thought about it. Maybe, actually. And maybe that might actually be a useful thing, because basically they become a gatekeeper into these new environments. So maybe we should have brokers assisting on the wards, that their sole job really is to help, you know, newcomers. And those newcomers could be post-grad, undergrad, and that's be their job for all newcomers, to really help them integrate.
Because, I mean, Lorraine's talking about an example that she's got in her university. So I think the broker could be different things in different places, but maybe thinking about it, maybe not so much as a broker, but, you know, maybe it's even about support mechanism. And then you're starting to get the message across that this is about support, and there is no stigma for support. This is just the way things work, and this is just the way things operate. That you will get support in your placements, or you will get support at this, or you will get support that. And then it maybe helps the stigmatize it. Thank you to everybody who's participated in the session today. A video of the session will be made, as I said earlier, available on the website in a few days, and we'll make sure that the question and the homework that Anique was asking you to do will be provided as well. So please be sure to sign up for future bite-sized sessions. They cover a wide range of issues and they're always really interesting. And our next session will take place on Tuesday, the 29th of September at 6 p.m. You join our JASME group as they showcase 4 widening participation initiatives from around the UK, all led or delivered by students and juniors. And it's always good to hear from students and juniors. They always have a good perspective and come over very articulate in what they're trying to say. And the session will include a panel discussion with representatives from these initiatives alongside Professor Colin McDougall, who is the chairman of our ASME Educational Development Committee, and Louise Aldridge, who is from the National Medical Schools Widening Participation Forum. And for more details, you can visit the ASME events page, which is www.asme.org.uk/events. And Anique's just joined us back just enough time to say, thank you very much, Anique, for that really interesting presentation. It generated a lot of debate. And in answer to Silky, the slides, the references, the recording and everything will be on the ASME website. Give us a few days just to tighten it all up and get it right, but it will all be there. So if you go to the ASME website, you'll be able to access everything that Anique has been talking about, including her slides and everything. So thank you all very much and thank you for participating. Goodbye.